Okay, I think I remember our next presenter just a little bit back from when we were both graduate students at Cornell, and I'm not going to say when that was, but we're both a little older now. But he left Cornell for warmer climates and left us in the snow and ice and went to finish his PhD at UCLA, and now he's still in California at UC Irvine. He's also published a book. I really like this title, Treacherous Translation. So please welcome our next speaker, Serk-Bae.
Now I remember who you are. Thank you, Professor Brzezinski, for a very nice introduction. It's very nice to see you again. And I'd like to thank also Professor Jisoo and Ann Yang and George Washington Institute for Korean Studies for inviting me. It's my honor to be here. But also I feel very humble to be among the very renowned scholars who have been working on Chunhyangjeon for many years, because I hardly can claim to be a specialist in Chunhyangjeon. My specialty is modern Korean literature. Actually, I got my PhD in Japanese history. It's a long story, so I don't want to waste the time by telling this long story. But so I'm hardly qualified to be here. But that being said, I wrote an article on a very it's kind of one isolated. No, it's not isolated. But it's one instance of cultural interactions between Japan and Korea during the colonial period around the Chunhyangjeon. So that's what I'm going to talk today. This Japanese theatrical troupe Shinkyo's staging of the play Chunhyangjeon in the Japanese language in 1938. And Korean and Japanese critics' responses to that performance. That's the topic of my talk. All right, let me, without further ado, and also I sincerely apologize for the crudeness of my PowerPoint presentation, especially compared to this wonderful, colorful slide you just saw. It's very monochrome and very boring. It's all, yeah, maybe I should, yeah, let me start here. If I still have time, maybe I'll give you a kind of interesting anecdote why I ended up with these slides, but I think I'd better go on. So let me just, so this paper actually is the main topic of this paper is it's about Chunhyangjeon, but it's also about this kind of criticism of the conventional understanding of translation, which is, seeing translation as an instance of transmitting information from one language to another, one culture to another. Actually, that's the main focus of my paper, on which my today's talk is based. But it's so kind of like a chunk of this article, the original article, has I don't say little to do with Chunhyangjeon, but it's not kind of away from Chunhyangjeon. So today, what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to read the parts of the essays in which actually I this staging of Chunhyangjeon in the Japanese language itself, rather than giving you kind of very boring theoretical discussion of translations and so on. That's what I'm going to do. So let me just read abstract very slowly, and then I'll just read the parts relevant to the Chunhyangjeon, staging of Chunhyangjeon itself, the colonial translation and so on. This essay examines the controversial staging of a Japanese language version of popular Korean romance, Chunhyangjeon, by the Japanese theatrical company Shinkyo in 1938 by analyzing the arguments of Japanese and Korean intellectuals about the play. I revealed the idea of translation as an equal exchange, the focus of much present-day theoretical debate on ethics and translation was embedded both in the colonizers' affirmation of the play as an exemplary step toward cultural assimilation and in the colonized protest against it as an inaccurate or unfaithful translation. I also examined how the limitations of colonized intellectuals' cultural nationalism led them to retreat to a conciliatory insistence on cultural autonomy. So yeah, that's kind of main intention of my original article, which is criticizing both colonialism and nationalism with one's tongue. But that's kind of less relevant to our conference theme. So I just read the part in which I discuss the staging of the 춘향전 play in the Japanese language. So, but before getting to that, let me just briefly go over these slides I prepared. Shinkyo is the Japanese theatrical company. It is kind of interesting because this theatrical company is identified by many, especially by Japanese authorities, as a Japanese leftist the artist organizations. So actually they were subject to persecution, not around this time, but later. So this the main force behind this formation of this theatrical company is Murayama Tomoyoshi. Murayama Tomoyoshi is a Japanese avant-garde artist, playwright, writer, painter, yeah. Anything you can imagine. He was actually one of those. But he so by around this time actually all these the leftist theatrical companies were disbanded by the government. So Murayama Tomoyoshi and his colleagues actually tried to revive this leftist, well, at least kind of social reformist tradition in Japanese the theatrical theater. So he with his colleagues organized this Shinkyo. So Shinkyo was viewed as a less radical than the previous leftist organizations, but it also still rooted in that tradition. So that's the one thing we should remember when we talk about this, the staging of the Japanese language 춘향전. There's a Shinkyo. Shinkyo is new solidarity, things like this, rough translation. And this is a newspaper article in Korean newspaper. I think it's 경성일보, the newspaper which was published by the Japanese government general in Korea, the colonial government. Okay, and this is the main female lead of that performance. Ichikawa, I cannot read actually. It's my glasses. I forgot her name actually. I wrote this article a decade ago, so actually I barely remember her name. But she was a kind of actually she was not very well known. She was very well known, but not as a kind of a theatrical performer. But it's more like a namkatsu film actress. But she was more popular and known for that rather than actually a theatrical performer. And this slide, I put up this slide just to tell you this kind of rather long story of translation from Korean to Japanese of 춘향전. So Nakarai Tosui is fairly well-known Japanese literary figure. He already serialized the 춘향전 prior to the Japanese annexation of Korea. So in 1882, he serialized 춘향전 in Asahi Shimbun, one of the major newspapers still today in Japan. And this is the first installment of that 춘향전 translation. You can see this distinctly Korean costumes here. 계림 정화 춘향전. This 계림 is refers to the shiraki in Japanese, but also it refers to Korean. Romance 춘향전. That's the translation. This is Murayama Tomoyoshi, the major guy who organized this theatrical company. His has a very interesting relationship with Korea. He was a leftist, so he was on the blacklist by the Japanese government. So around 1944, 1945, he felt threatened in Japan, to be in Japan. So he actually went to Korea to hide from the authorities. And actually, he witnessed the liberation of Korea in Korea. And his Korean friends actually let him in. So, but also there was a rumor that actually he was spying for the Japanese government. I don't know which one. Probably that's just apocryphal story, but anyhow, he's an interesting guy. And actually, always wondering why he was so much interested in Korea. I don't know why. But actually, one of my PhD students, actually, she's writing a dissertation about the cultural interactions between Korea and Japan after the end of Japanese colonial rule. And one chapter concerns Murayama Tomoyoshi's several attempts at staging Chunyanjeon. This one actually is not just isolated endeavor on the part of Murayama Tomoyoshi to stage Chunyanjeon. Even after the end of Japanese colonial rule, he attempted to stage opera version of Chunyanjeon in collaboration with, collaboration sounds bad. So in cooperation with Chinese Koreans. Chinese is Korean residents in Japan in 1960s and so on. And his interest in Chunyanjeon never died. That's interesting why he was so much obsessed with Chunyanjeon. So initially I thought probably he had a, I don't know, let me stop there. It's not grounded. This is my total conjecture, so I shouldn't share that in public. But anyhow, this guy is one of the main figures, one of the main figures of the staging of the Chunyanjeon performance. Jang Hyuk-jo, he is the playwright of the Japanese language play Chunyanjeon. He was Korean, but he was naturalized as a Japanese citizen after the end of Japanese colonial rule. And so he abandoned his Korean wife, and he married a Japanese woman. He changed his name, and he became Japanese. But nevertheless, he is always thought about Korea, actually. Even into 1960s, 70s, he wrote about Korea. Korean War and so on. It's an interesting guy, another interesting guy, Murayama Tomoyoshi and Jang Hyuk-jo. But he debuted actually as a writer in Japan as a kind of a leftist or socialist sympathizer. His first novel, the short story, is Gakido is about the horrible working conditions of Japanese laborers in colonial Korea. So he was, but later actually he became one of those collaborators with Japanese colonial rule. And his story about Buddha, the Siddhartha, the Buddha, was actually translated into English and was published in India. It's an interesting guy. But anyhow, so that's kind of main figures, and then of this performance. That's great, nice story. You have to bear with my presentation, whether you like it or not, for 20 more minutes. So, okay, let me just read that. So this, I skipped all this boring theoretical, so yeah, continental philosophy. Just let me get directly into this part. The ambivalent text and treacherous translation. Chunyanjeon's popularity grew during the colonial period, especially from the mid-1930s on, when theatrical performances of the story increased in Korea. The Korean students' theatrical company, 학생 예술자, staged the Korean dramatist Yu Chijin's Korean language play Chunyanjeon in Tokyo in 1937. After seeing it, the playwright and the director Murayama Tomoyoshi decided to stage his own theatrical version of 춘향전 in Japanese. Murayama was one of the leading figures in the proletariat Engeki Undo, Japan Proletarian Theater League. In 1934, he proposed consolidating of various leftist theatrical companies, and that same year founded the Shinkyo Gekidan, Shinkyo theatrical company, until it was closed by the government in 1940. Shinkyo Gekidan continued to stage realistic plays dealing with social issues and consequently maintained its reputation as the premier leftist company. In an article published in Josen Oyobi Manshu, just before the play was first staged in Japan, Murayama explained why he chose to stage a Japanese language version of the story. First, he wanted to present Japanese people with Korean culture, which he regarded as one of the maternal bodies, botai, of Japanese culture. Second, he specifically selected 춘향전 among Korean literary works because it was the most popular and thus most representative literary creation of Korea. Third, he hoped to entertain Koreans in Japan and expected many of them to see the play. He claimed that since the story contained the soul of Korea, he would attempt to depict the story's Koreanness, as precisely as possible. Murayama asked the writer Jang Hyuk-ju to write the Japanese language script. Jang Hyuk-ju, the guy that showed. 6 years earlier, Chang had debuted in the Japanese literary establishment, winning second place in the 1932 Kaizo Literary Award. His short story, honored by the judges, Gakido, described the hardship of Korean peasants, Korean peasants, not laborers, on the Japanese group. Chang studied various versions of the story before writing the script for Murayama, including Changguk. Changguk is Korean style of version of 춘향전. Murayama felt that Chang's script lacked dramatic tension and revised it with the help of Yu Chi-jin, another famous Korean dramatist and playwright. Interestingly, Murayama introduced elements of kabuki, promoted as one of the most Japanese forms of stage art, into the play, even though he had pledged that he would present the Koreanness of the story as faithfully as possible. He also experimented with transgender casting in the play, probably as an homage to kabuki tradition of male actors playing female roles. Murayama reversed the kabuki convention, however, by casting a female actor, Akaki Ranko, in the role of the hero, Lee Mong-young. The movie star Nikatsu Studio, yes, Ichikawa Haruyo, that's her name, Ichikawa Haruyo. The movie star of the Nikatsu Nikatsu Studio, Ichikawa Haruyo, was given the part of the heroine Chunhyang. Other male roles were played by male actors. Incorporating elements of kabuki was an important innovation. Murayama explained that opened up new possibilities for modern theater. Murayama's decision provoked controversy. One reviewer argued that kabuki-style acting infused into the play made it difficult to locate Koreanness, while another regarded it as a symptom of the commercialization of the Shinkyo theatrical company. Nonetheless, reviews of the play were mostly favorable, but for varying reasons. Both the government and critics of the government, Japanese government, appreciated the play's success for utterly different reasons. For example, Hirata Isao, the thought prosecutor notorious for his role in the Tenko. Tenko is ideological conversion of the Communist Party leaders Sano Manabu and Nabeyama Sadakichi, wrote a review in the magazine Teatro that reflected the essence of the government response. While praising the play for keeping away from ideology and offering a fantasy, Hirata, the thought prosecutor, maintained that by incorporating elements of the kabuki style into a modern drama, the play contributed to the further development of Japanese traditional performance art. Moreover, he extolled its it as an effort to promote the harmony between Japan and Korea, and did not forget to mention the importance of Korea in the Sino-Japanese War. Alongside Hirata's review, Teatro published another review by Fuse Tatsushi, a lawyer famous for defending leftists and Koreans. Fuse read into the play an allegory of the plight of the colonized. Fuse called attention to the differing responses of the Korean and Japanese audience members. He found that certain scenes evoked tears from the Korean audience, but laughter from the Japanese. He encouraged Japanese audiences to ponder over the meaning of anger and tears of the Korean audience, and insinuated that the emotions of the Korean audience were related to the colonial reality in which they were caught. He continued to imply that Chunhyang determined faithfulness to her husband in the face of threats from the local magistrate signified more than one woman's loyalty to her lover. In the end, he suggested that Chunhyang was elevated to a heroic character to reproach the unjust authority. These diverse and even conflicting reviews suggest that the play itself was haunted by ambivalence, allowing viewers to read various subtexts into it. Both critical intellectuals and government officials surely saw the play with its exotic costumes and kabuki-style acting as a departure from Shinkyo's reputation as a leftist theatrical company, and one review criticized it for the same commercialism for which Hirata, the thought prosecutor, praised it. The play nonetheless retained in the tradition of leftist theater certain scenes, including Korean peasants suffering from unjust rule, that could be interpreted as carrying political messages. It thus allowed viewers to see as criticism of Japanese colonial rule if they stretched their sensitivity to colonial injustice enough to juxtapose the play's historical context with the present colonial reality to which the colonized was subjected. After a successful 20-day run at the Suzuki Little Theater in Tokyo in March and April 1938, the performance was taken to Osaka and Kyoto. Later that same year, Shinkyo launched a tour of Korea, which Murayama proudly claimed was the first time a Japanese theatrical company had performed for Korean audiences in Korea. The play was performed not only by Japanese actors, but also in the Japanese language for the colonized Korean audiences. And Murayama expected it to promote cultural exchange in theater between Japan and Korea. Akita Uzato, a dramatist and a writer who went to Korea with Shinkyo, said that the company wanted to perform in Korea not just because the play had been successful in Japan, but because it was desirable to show Koreans the results of the cultural blending between the two peoples. In contrast to the mixed reviews in Japan, the response of Korean reviewers was uniformly unfavorable, skeptical, and even hostile. The Korean critics viewed Jang Hyuk-ju, who wrote the script of the play, in the Japanese language. The Korean critics viewed Jang's script as a poor translation of a text and a culture, and said it did not measure up to the original story. In a Japanese language review printed in a Japanese language journal, Josen, the philologist Shin Tae-hyun harshly criticized the play for failing to deliver an accurate representation of Korean customs and culture. He said that Jang clearly did not know enough about Chunhyang's story. The literary critic Lee Won-jo also disapproved of Jang's translation of the original language of Chunhyangjeon. He saw Chunhyangjeon's particular value as resulting from the pansori form in which it was narrated. Since Chunhyangjeon had been transcribed from songs performed before audiences, it retained the meters of the original verses. Thus, he argued the value of Chunhyangjeon had everything to do with its language. He contended that Jang's rendering of the story neutralized this original musicality. Jang responded by adamantly claiming that his script was his own creation, not a translation. Chang acknowledged the multiple origins of the story 춘향전, 판소리, and Changguk versions as well as those in written form. He explained that he initially had tried to translate the story word for word from written versions, but found it impossible to preserve the charm of the original tale. Consequently, he decided to write his own modern 춘향전 by borrowing only storyline, characters, and setting. Chang also insisted on the heterogeneity of the origin of the story in order to argue that there was no single reference point for his script and that it was not a translation parasitically dependent on the original text. If Chang's claim was not unreasonable, neither was the Korean critic's insistence that his script was a translation. Chang asserted on several occasions that he wrote the script with the intention of introducing Korean culture to Japanese audiences. In that sense, what he did with 춘향전 was present the story to those who did not share language and culture as well as those who regarded the story as their own. In other words, he translated an original story that was representative of Korean culture into another language that could be understood by Japanese audiences. As long as Chang's script was connected to the original story that supposedly represented authentic Korean culture and customs, and as long as Chang's intention with the script was to show Korean culture and customs to Japanese people who did not know that much about them, Koreans regarded the play as translation in a negative sense, as a secondary parasitic copy of the original. Korean critics took issue with Chang's representation of the original story because they seemed it to be an inaccurate translation. How many minutes? 5? Okay, that's enough. I think I can finish within 5. yeah. Let me see. Let's skip this. Okay. Yeah, I'll try to finish. The problem of translation as equal exchange and its collusion with colonial domination surfaced in a roundtable discussion among Japanese and Korean intellectuals, convened as a Japanese language 춘향전 went on stage in Seoul in late October 1938. Murayama and Akita from Shinkyo, a Keijo University professor of Chinese literature named Karashima Takeshi, and Furukawa Kanehide, the director of the publication censorship section of the government general, was joined by the writer Hayashi Fusao, who was visiting Hayashi Fusao's big name actually in Japanese literature, who was visiting Korea on his way to Manchuria and northern China. That's a Japanese panelist. This roundtable discussion. And Koreans on the panel included Chang Hyuk-ju, the poet Jung Ji-yong, the literary critic, and poet Im Hwa, the writer and Bosung College professor Yu Jin-ho, and the literary critic Kim Moon-jip, the writer Lee Tae-jun, and Yu Chi-jin, the dramatist who had helped Murayama revise Chang's script. Convened under the title Future of Korean Culture, the roundtable had not been intended to discuss the play per se, but the play became a topic of discussion. The Koreans argued unanimously that 춘향전 could not be translated and that once translated, its value, its identity as 춘향전 would be lost. Hayashi countered by asking whether they were suggesting the total denial of translation. Karashima, the Keijo Imperial University professor in Chinese literature, Karashima shrewdly tried to maneuver the discussion in a different direction. He took on a point previously made by a Korean participant that professional writers in Korea faced economic difficulties because of the small market for literary works. Karashima said that if Korean writers got their works translated into Japanese, they would find a bigger market among Japanese readers. However, Karashima's economic argument failed to divert the Korean participants from returning to the problem of translation. The Koreans insisted that 춘향전 had lost its inherent value in the course of translation into Chang and Murayama's play, since it could not be expressed in Japanese. In response to the Koreans' persistence, Murayama admitted that the Japanese might feel the same way about an English translation of Manyoshu, the 1,000-year-old verse collection that nationalist scholars considered the essence of Japan. Nevertheless, he also argued that Japanese translation of Chunhyangjeon was necessary because Japanese people could not read Korean. In response, Kim Moon-jil, that's a good reason for translation. In response, Kim Moon-jil bluntly asked whether the Japanese language Chunhyangjeon was staged out of political rather than cultural necessity. Lee Tae-jun, who had kept silent, abruptly asked Japanese participants whether Korean writers should keep writing in Korean or whether they should instead create literary works in Japanese. Akita and Murayama, following Karashima, adhered to a purely economic logic. They argued that since the number of Japanese language readers was greater than that of their Korean counterparts, it might be better to write in Japanese because they would have access to a larger market. Akita added that if they had difficulty writing in Japanese, they surely could get their works translated into Japanese. But Hayashi urged the Koreans to pen their writings in Japanese. Murayama offered a compromise. Korean writers should create literary works in Japanese while reserving the Korean language for expressions that they deem untranslatable. The Korean intellectuals showed two levels of concern vis-a-vis colonial translation in the course centered in the discourse centered around the staging of the Japanese language Chunhyangjeon. One level, they were wary of misrepresentation of Korean culture and customs to colonizers. On the other, they were even more suspicious of translation as an interim stage in the total assimilation of Korean culture into Japanese. The first level of concern troubling the Korean intellectuals was the colonized mistrust of translation as representation of their culture and literature, and eventually of themselves. Translation framed as representation does not do justice to the original. The original is inevitably distorted in representation. In other words, the colonized complained about the inevitable difference of any translation from its original. The text of Chunhyangjeon could not be translated into languages other than Korean. In the eyes of the Koreans, the translation of Chunhyangjeon was not an equal exchange between Korean and Japanese. Something valuable was lost in translation that was so essential to the story that Chunhyangjeon was not Chunhyangjeon anymore. The difference in the medium of expressing made Chunhyangjeon secondary and inferior to the original. The exchange transpiring in the course of translating Chunhyangjeon was not equal exchange. In short, the Korean resistance to translation pointed to their aversion to unequal exchange. The Korean intellectuals insisted that the translation of Chunhyangjeon and the Korean literature, in general for that matter, was impossible because it could not guarantee equal exchange between the two languages. They sensed that the translation at issue was not just a linguistic and literary matter, but a political one. They did not flinch from raising their suspicion that the staging of the Japanese language play had much to do with the current political situation of the Sino-Japanese War, which required the total mobilization of the colony for Japanese war effort. Discourse centered around Chunhyangjeon, however, did not stop at the colonizers' imposition of and the colonized resistance to translation. The Koreans' aversion to translation indicated their instinctive understanding of the collusion between colonialism and translation, which provoked the second level of their concern over colonial translation. Like translation that intends to bridge the difference between two languages and cultures while indicating that very difference, colonialism aims to erase the difference between colonized and the colonizer, while simultaneously retaining discriminatory practices against the colonized, marked with the difference it claims to eradicate. The Koreans, as the colonized, knew well that the erasure of difference between them and the Japanese meant the extermination of their difference from the colonizer, not the other way around. In other words, when it comes to the intention of colonial power to erase difference from the colonized and the colonizer, the burden of erasing difference falls on the shoulders of the colonized. It is the colonizer who must change to adapt to colonial reality, not the colonizer. The biggest difference between the colonized and the colonizer in the realm of literature is language. If the erasure of difference took place in literature, it would be tantamount to the extermination of the Korean language. Thus, discourse concerning Shinyanjeon and translation evolved into the discussion of Korean's creative writing in the Japanese language. Okay, I'll stop. That's okay, I think. You got the message, maybe.